without too much further ado, we're going to dive into the agenda. So we've got, first up will be Chad Renando and Di Somerville, followed by Rachel West, Tori, Carly, and then we're going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. Each of the speakers will have between 5 and 8 minutes to speak, and we'll be monitoring the Q&A, which is in the chat thread. So if you have questions, post them. We'll be picking them up and using them as the basis for the Q&A. When you registered, there were also a couple of questions about opportunities and challenges. We've done some analysis on that, and that is heavily informing what we're presenting today. I'll also flag at the end, we're going to talk about future webinars and other resources, including Slack channels, etc., to continue this conversation. And all of the panelists have generously offered to be on call and available for any further questions after. So yeah, many ways to ask your questions and get them answered. But if it's during the webinar, please use the chat forum, and we'll pick them up for that 20 minutes Q&A at the end. All right, without further ado, welcome Chad Renando from Startup Status and Global Entrepreneurship Network. So Chad's going to give us sort of big picture overview. Take it away, Chad.
Great, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for helping get everything set up. I'm just going to cover a few things briefly. One of them is just to acknowledge who's in the room. We had the conversation about how we were going to do this. We talked, do we want to Zoom, want everybody to be able to interact, and that would have been ideal. And then as the response started to increase and we passed over the 100-point line and we had about a 200 and some odd people register for this, we turned it into a webinar. But that will evolve as we go on. But those of you who are here, you're the builders, you're the doers, you're the ones that are actually building the ecosystems out there, supporting others and helping them build, grow, and scale their business. And that's important because of acknowledging where we are at within the ecosystem at the moment. Most of the innovation ecosystem in Australia, as we know it, has only been around for the last 5 years. From around 2015, we saw a massive explosion of innovation hubs and co-working spaces, accelerator programs, and all of that. And so what we've seen is new organizations trying to figure out not only to have their own business, but how to work with each other. How do I get funding? Even as of recently, we're seeing shifts in government funding. We're seeing new actors enter into the system. People have been doing it for 2-3 years, leaving on to move on to other things, and at times getting burnt out. It's a hard road that a lot of you have gone down, and a lot of you have been doing it for some time. I want to acknowledge that because here we are in the current situation, which can often feel like it's more challenging on top of challenge. And some of the feedback we've gotten in the survey questions is, we've been through the fires and the floods and the impacts, and now there's this. And so we acknowledge that it is a challenge. And then also we want to talk about the fact that we are a regional nation. About 30% of our economic value, of our population, of our businesses are outside the regional areas. And that does have an impact on how we operate as a country, which leads us into the third point of a round of our opportunities. We have, quite often when I go overseas, I talk to people and they say, hey, thanks very much for coming along. How do you do regional better? How do you engage in places that are remote and not part of the metro cities? People are looking to us to say, how do we do it? Quite often, if you have an event in a metro area, they live stream to have the regional areas included. Whereas right now, what this has done is it's completely leveled the playing field. And one of the dominant things that everybody said, probably about 70 to 80% of you said, how do we take our services online? Not dissimilar to what we're doing now. And many of us have seen new opportunities for webinars and training and things like that come through. In addition to how do we give some sense of stability for the people that we're actually supporting, in addition to trying to make ourselves sustainable at the same time. So I wanted to frame all of that. That's the intent of us then trying to bring people together to say, how do we support the builders and the doers and the people that have been working within the ecosystem, some of them just coming in and some of them for some time, that we can tap into some of that experience. So that's to frame it up. I would like to now hand over to Di, who's one of the thought leaders in regional innovation, the CEO of the Regional Pitch Fest, the formation of the 8.8 Regional Conference, and now doing some excellent work with Bridge Hub, connecting people within the agriculture over to global areas such as Israel. And so for who better to have a bit of a chat on what she's seeing around the traps, I'd like to hand over to Di.
Thanks, Chad, and thanks for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for allowing me to be part of this. It's fantastic. So just to start with, I'll give a quick snapshot of what I've been seeing happening in Israel. So there's a few things that are going on in the startup nation. And probably the biggest one, which I'm sure you're all starting to sense, is the financial impact. And this is specifically the financial impact for startups, but also the financial impact for us that are running hubs. So people in Israel are really looking at examples of what other startups and businesses have gone through crisis previously and what were their lessons learned. So looking back to the GFC, looking back to, to things like the internet bubble, what did startups do and how did they get through this? What did hubs do and how did they get through this? So that's sort of where their headspace is at as far as the financial piece is concerned. On the events side, everything's been cancelled, very similar to here. We're getting notification after notification that stuff's been cancelled. It's been moved online. We're seeing a little bit of that. And a lot of their events are actually being postponed. But people at the moment, or maybe around 2 or 3 days ago, were really busy on how to survive. They were looking at how to survive before they were looking at what's work look like. They're now moving and transitioning into that what work looks like. And we're starting to get to that point as well. What's happening in their hubs over there is a lot of their hubs have given waivers for rent or reduced rent. Now, that's really easy for them to do in some respects because they are hugely supported by large companies and by the government. So a bit of a different landscape here. From an investment point of view, people are stopping to look at things. They're putting things on hold. A lot of these investors have a lot of money in the stock market, so they're really reassessing. So expecting everything there to sort of come to a bit of a halt. Their government response is not too dissimilar to ours at the moment from a financial point of view. And from the innovation sector, they're expecting that a lot of the focus may actually go to big industry and not necessarily to the innovation sector. They're looking now at that what next. So the business webinars like this, lectures, all of those things are popping up all over the place. And a lot of people now are activating online. They're looking to add new skills, to take the opportunity to learn. And people are not wanting to stay isolated. They're wanting to connect with people. So yeah, they're starting to really churn on that. So they're about 10 days ahead of us. So if you kind of put that into perspective. So that's the Israel piece as I see it. Just a couple of things I wanted to touch on as well is some practical ways in hubs and co-working spaces that you might be able to start helping now if you're feeling a bit helpless, and what can you do? So the biggest piece is to communicate with your community more than ever. You need to be asking them, what is it that they need? What is going to be of value for them? Don't be afraid to be asking for help. So it's taking that step back and really understanding how you provide value for your community, and start thinking outside your normal markets. So looking at who else in your community can the startup community actually assist? Can those innovative thinkers start to help unpack problems and challenges? This is our jam, right? So how can we start helping those local governments, those tourism bodies, whatever it is, it's our time to shine. So broaden your view of who is in your community. Be realistic, okay? Think a few steps ahead. This is not a typical she'll be right, mate, Australian attitude moment. This is let's start thinking ahead and think ahead to when this is done. How are you going to market your space? And I'll put some content up in the Slack group when you get to that about the opportunity for co-working spaces out of the back of this. Really keeping a routine for yourself, but also putting this out there for your members is important, even if you're not doing the same work. So encourage others to do the things that they've never had time to do, to study and to learn. Now, we might not be at that point yet. We're still in the, oh my God, the world's going to close down and how do I survive mode, but it will come out of that to the point where people know that maybe this is the norm for the moment, and their brains will start to open up to other opportunities. So be ready for that. And what I really wanted to sort of finish on, I've got a heap more information, and I'm happy to share that with you as we progress over the weeks and months ahead. But really take a step back and understand that it's not all doom and gloom, and that positivity is a really good choice to take here, because what is the role of innovation in times of uncertainty? It's really important. And it's really important to look for those opportunities, to seek them out at a time like this. And there were just two examples that I thought of or came across in the last sort of 24 hours of examples of how great innovations have come out of like times of crisis, not stability. So the first one was the internet. So it was invented during the Cold War. And that was, you know, something that came out of a time of crisis. And the second was that tree that Newton sat under. And I've put a few of the articles that relate to this in the Slack channel. And, you know, for me, I look at those examples and think, well, if Newton wasn't sent home from Cambridge and had time to ponder and think on his family farm, which is where I am now, that apple would never have fallen on his head. So just remember that this can be a life-changing opportunity for us, and giving ourselves time to think is really a great opportunity. And, you know, no one knows if we got out of our pajamas before noon or not. You know, it's been really nice to put some makeup and nice clothes on, because the first time I've done it in 4 days. So thanks, guys. And thanks, Chad and everyone. I'm happy to take your questions as they come through. So throw back to the next one.
Thank you very much, Di and Chad, for a very energised intro. For those that have just joined us, Andrew Althwaite here. Thanks for jumping on the webinar. We've got it recording. We've got about 100 participants online at the moment. And our next speaker is Rachel West. So Rachel works with storytellers, speakers, influencers, founders to get their messages across in powerful ways. And she's going to tell us about storytelling at this time. Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Andrew, and hi, everybody. Storytelling has been incredibly trendy. And if you can remember what the world looked like a week and a half ago, in our sector, one of the main ways we were seeing storytelling was in pitch nights, where an entrepreneur opens a 4-minute pitch with a moving story that attracts investment. And in general, storytelling has almost become synonymous with branding and business. But I think since we've taken this opportunity to come together and ask these bigger questions about long-term viability and contribution to community, it's an opportunity to get more sophisticated about how we think about story. There are lots of different kinds of story, and there are lots of different ways we use story, including the way that we make meaning for ourselves and the way we understand the meaning that other people are making. So a little bit like we would tell the businesses that we're supporting, it's important that we take the time to first listen to all of the stories that are already there in our communities or are emerging. As Di's talked about, these times for many people are very uncertain, and the way they're making meaning may shift. And as we do that, we can also hone our skills at looking beyond the individual stories, holding them all, so as to tune into the deeper narrative that's running through. And if we do this listening is what's going to allow us to more fully respond to and reflect the changing nature of the communities that we all really want to help. I know for many of you, bushfire season is still in your minds. If any of the media sites, anything to go by, it's completely off the radar. So looking back on bushfires in Australia and thinking about them in perspective, there was a main theme of climate change. And we had within that theme, we had stories that within that, things like the effect on vulnerable populations, the difference in perception between cities and people in the regions. We had stories about how a government responds to crisis. And there were sub-stories of mental resilience and community resilience. So if you look back on that, what we considered a crisis, you can see that all of those stories are relevant and have their place. So you wouldn't take one of those and say, oh, well, Bega should just tell the story of the human causes of climate change, because that would ignore, for example, all of those people whose houses burnt down. And so with COVID-19, it's the same thing. There will be many, many stories. And when we take that moment to stop and hold all of those stories, we start to tune into a deeper narrative about how our country or our state is making meaning out of what's happening at the moment. So for today, when I say story, I'm going to use that to mean a more isolated account of events. And when I say narrative, it's kind of the way we piece together stories in order to construct meaning. And when I wrote about this topic recently, I called it storytelling in turbulent times. And I'm actually using the language of a Melbourne theatre maker, Kimberly Twiner. I thought this word turbulence is so good because if you think about turbulent waters, it's got eddies and ripples and waterfalls. So if you just looked at one bit of the turbulence, say like a whirlpool, you might think the river was going around and around. But if you look at all of the bits of the river, shall we say all of the stories of the river, then you know which way the river's going. So we, in our communities, can really start to tune into all of those ripples and flows. And then when we've done listening and we're ready to start telling a story, I've got 3 things to keep in mind. And the first thing to keep in mind comes from the story of resilience that Scott Morrison really picked up on in the bushfires. He basically said, Australians have been through tough times, we will get through this. And it's technically true, but for me, when I heard this particular interview, there was a bit of an ick factor. And I think it was because it missed context. If any of you watched Q&A on March 2, Hamish MacDonald said to Cheryl McCarthy, who was a director of Surf Life Saving New South Wales Far South Coast region, that she'd been really considered a community leader because she was at Bermagui Evacuation Centre when they had 5,000 people come for safety. And she really acknowledged the community spirit and resilience. And she said, I had a whole team, but actually I think we were saved by the wind. I hate to think what would have happened if we had 5,000 people to keep safe and the wind had changed. So what does community resilience and pulling through look like in the possibility that 5,000 people could have died? So as we go forward, we want to be encouraging and supportive, but also be careful of latching on to a story of optimism without first tuning into what it is, because it won't land. And Di's spoken about, for example, some people still being in survival mode. Story 2. Coronavirus in most people is a mild illness. Now, in the beginning, this really sounded like if you're sick and you're old, sorry. Now, luckily, we have changed our messaging around this to the people we are most worried about. But the moral of the story is make sure when you're telling a story that you think of the effect on the people who are outside that story. And my final story, kind of anecdote, is the one that has led to panic buying. And that goes something like, we're going the same way as Italy. Our government's not doing enough. We need to care for ourselves. And so you can see how this story, reinforced by certain behaviours, could feed into a deeper narrative of a sense of individual lack. And you might have seen then on Tuesday that the government said in an address, actually, we're in this for the long haul. It's not viable to shut everything down. Now, we can agree or disagree on the practical things that they've actually put in place, but the point of that anecdote is to say that there was suddenly a trajectory that we could see. And Laura Tingle, who's a commentator in the political space, said Scott Morrison was looking beyond the curve. So when you tell your story, think about the curve that you're speaking to and what's beyond that curve. So in sum, I've covered that there's no one right story. By listening to all of the stories, we get to tune into a deeper narrative, which is the place from which we can do our best work. When you're going to tell a story, be cognizant of its context, the effect for people outside your story, and the trajectory in time. We're going to have a lot of stories appearing that help us each make meaning. And so if you look around and if Australia shuts down its cities or plays music from its windows, or if we go completely online, this is possibly going to look different to what it looks like in China or Italy or the States, because we have a different cultural narrative. So really, when you have the space beyond survival, pay attention to the ripples and the eddies and the whirlpools that show us where the river is flowing, because that's when we're going to be able to help our communities in a way that allows us all to go together.
Cool. Thank you so much, Rachel. Yeah, the fantastic contributions so far. I think painting the picture of both the extent of the people who are on this call, this incredible network of hubs we have across the nation, how that can be an asset for our local communities and our roles as community leaders, and attentiveness to what stories and narratives we're contributing to, hearing, and responding to. So that's fantastic context. And we know from the questions and your responses to your registration questions that a lot of people are interested about models and ways that they can diversify their revenue streams or survive as a hub quite practically, as well as understanding what sort of a role we can play as leaders in the community. So to pick up on those topics, I'd love to introduce Tori Kopke from Big Ideas Rural, who's recently run a massive online webinar and series of events out of WA's wheatbelt. So welcome, Tori.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity. Ordinarily, if this were being presented in person, I wouldn't logistically be able to make it to a capital city. I am coming to you guys from our family farm in the wheat belt of WA. So congratulations everyone for taking a step forward in inclusivity. Like we're really approaching that diverse and inclusive environment, and we no longer have to look to our local geography for experts. And this is a really exciting time for everyone. And so, yeah, thank you for having me involved. Otherwise, like I said, if it were in person, I probably wouldn't be here. So for the last 6 months, I have been running an online community for regional businesswomen, and it started when my co-founder, who's based in Cunnamulla, Queensland, and I collaborated, and we just said, look, we need more resources. Women, most of them were caring for children that were in this community that we started creating. They weren't able to travel. They weren't able to get to these amazing hubs that you guys have created. And so we've created one online. So I just want to talk about 5 different types of online programs that are really practical for you to implement in your communities and in your hubs, as well as give you some tips around making these events and making your communities successful. So obviously there's one-to-one advisory, which is really easy to do over Zoom. So that's the program we're all using now. It's an easy to use interface. The next one is webinars. So webinars are fantastic. They're less interactive. They're more focused usually on one topic and then have a Q&A at the end. Workshops and masterclasses. I think within community hubs, workshops are such a big part of them. You know, you get your people together, you have an amazing presenter, there's a lot of interaction and flow, and translating that into an online space can be a bit tricky. So I find that online masterclasses need a little bit more structure than you might find in a workshop, but just getting presenters that are conscious of that and keen to do that and have some experience in the space, I think you can still have a fantastic workshop or masterclass experience online. Obviously courses, you can do a self-paced course, a drip-fed course, using a combination of, you know, online delivery, presentation style like this, homework, lots of different options around that. I have designed an online course before, so if that's something that your hub wants to do, is take all the information you have and put it into a central place that your community can access, that might be a fantastic idea. And then, as mentioned, a summit or an event or conference. So for International Women's Day last week, we ran a 500-person online event with 18 speakers over 2 days. Women from every corner of the globe, of the country tuned in. Mia Friedman was our keynote speaker. She blew us away. Her live Q&A was fantastic. And it just proves that you really can still have that massive conference experience, even in a virtual space. So things that we did to make that specific event a success, we had breakout networking that was offline so that people could still connect. We had virtual goodie bags, we had lucky door prizes, we had yoga sessions, so we had a yoga instructor, so everyone was stretching at their desks. Thinking outside the box, it's what we do as innovators. We need to make sure that we're not taking that hat off just because of a crisis. So it's incredible what you can do. I don't recommend starting with 18 speakers in 2 days. Maybe start with 4. That was our first event, was 4 speakers. And we did that for International Rural Women's Day in October last year. So yeah, it's a really great opportunity, and you can create incredible event feelings around that. So how do we make these events a success, and how do we make a community that's online a success? User experience, I want to start there. Take away the intimidation factor for your audience. Tell them what it's going to feel like when they get on. Is their webcam going to be on? Is their microphone going to be on? What is this interface going to feel like? Educate them before you even expect them to sign up for it. So taking away that fear is huge. It's how you get great buy-in, as well as a multifaceted approach. So think about not just one delivery platform. Here today, we have Zoom, as well as we're going to have the Slack channel. So we're approaching it from different angles. Use the technology that your audience likes to use. So if they're hanging out on Facebook, you need to go hang out on Facebook, even if you don't like it. If they're hanging out on Instagram, you need to go hang out on Instagram. Give them what they want in the arena that they're already hanging out in, and give them value. Diana touched on that, yeah, value is super important. I do want to say, use existing technology to deliver programs. We're innovators. We love getting fancy. Drop your idea of creating a portal or a forum or anything. We don't have time. Use the programs and the technology that already exists. This is not when it's time to innovate in that space. It's time to use the programs that exist and innovate with those programs. And then lastly, I just want to say that I've come together with a few different event partners, and we are doing a webinar next week about diversifying income streams using digital technology. And so it may not be necessarily something for you to attend, but it might be something for your audience to attend. So I'd love to welcome you on board as an event partner, and it could be your first step into the digital space. So if you are interested in joining and supporting that, I would love to, yeah, continue the conversation offline. I'll hand that back to you, Andrew.
Cool. Fantastic. Thank you, Tori. Yeah, incredible case study, and great to have you dialing in from the Wheatbelt on WA. And so going back to capital city context, very excited to welcome Carly Norman from Space Cubed, who's not only going to tell us about what Space Cubed and is doing across their programs and spaces in Perth, but also a few insights from Asia, as she's just returned from the coworking Asia Unconference. Okay, so welcome, Carly.
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to be here as well. I will start this by saying I returned from Indonesia almost 2 weeks ago, and I have no flu symptoms, but I am still self-isolating at home, as I believe so many of us are. Such a great opportunity here today as well to have so many people from not only, I guess, a regional, but also a national perspective as well. So I work for a company called Space Cubed. For those of you who don't know us, we operate co-working spaces. We run accelerator programs. We, through that, we also invest in early stage startups. We run coding workshops for women in capital cities nationally and regionally as well. And to date, we have almost 1,000 members. So this is a key time as well for us to be practicing what we preach with remote work and transitioning people online as well. And what I'd really love to talk to everybody today about is community and what that looks like, particularly as those of us who run hubs and innovation centres. I think often there's a lot of talk about online and online community and what that looks like, but it can be very easy to default to a physical location. I think for those of us operating spaces and hubs at the moment as well, what is really key to focus on is the reason that things like co-working started in the first place. Obviously, there will be local sensitivities to why a co-working space has established in your community. But a lot of the time, these spaces started because of social isolation problems with people working remotely and people working for themselves. And that's what brought people in to co-working spaces and hubs. It was for support, it was for understanding, and as well for often business support too. Now, as we're all going back into remote work and working from home, those problems still exist. And I think it's really key for us to look at how we can transition what we do when people came into our physical spaces and highlight that online. So I think it's really key, and I was going to talk more on this, but I feel that a lot of people have already talked about it earlier today, so I'll skip right over it. But really be sensitive to the needs of your community. Reach out, ask questions, find out what people are struggling with, and then see how you can help and adapt. Tori's point about using tools that people are already comfortable on and are already engaging on are really important. We're seeing a lot of panic, as I'm sure a lot of other people are within their local communities as well. It's really important to understand that people's stresses at the moment are quite split. They might be worried for their family. They might be concerned about if their children need to be withdrawn from school. There might be financial stresses if there is a job in the household that can't be done from home. There's physical labour, and at the moment we don't know what that will look like in terms of support for those workers. So I think that being really sensitive to that as well, and ensuring that your community has space for that and is accessible, is really important. Understanding why your community came together initially. It could be because you were at a remote location and you needed to band together and create a central hub. It might be because you had passion for a certain topic, for example, fintech, and you found that that was quite scattered and you needed a place that people could come together, have speakers and hold meetups to support that particular industry. Whatever it was that helped create your community is what you're going to need to consider as your key driver now as we all transition online as well. During this time also, it's probably important to kind of feel that we equally need support as operators as well, and people who are working in this space. You don't have to go at this alone. Collaboration is such a fantastic vehicle to support your communities. Look to what your peers are doing. Look to what other people in the space are working on. Can you partner? Are there opportunities to work with other hubs, other groups, and other operators to share and cross-program as well? The pressure to go online doesn't need to rest on just you wholly and solely. I know that a lot of these programs are run quite lean staffing as well. The weight of moving everything onto an online forum on your team can be quite stressful when we're all already dealing with an ever-changing environment. And I think that a collaborative effort is really key. And what is your niche? For example, we run a +8 accelerator program and a pre-accelerator. I know that they are transitioning everything online for the coming year. We were due to go to Singapore. No longer is that going to happen. But they're also putting that out and extending it to any other small businesses that would like to come on board to access not the whole, but portions of that program under an Adapt, Don't Stop banner, with an idea that if you are also transitioning, come on board, pick up the units and the modules as a part of that program that might apply to your business now. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. That's something that we've done now in its 4th year, and we're happy to open that up as well to other small businesses that need that access and support right now. But similarly, we probably wouldn't look to double up with the kind of programming that Tori is running. We would refer people to Tori and possibly look to see if that's something that we can, and again, possibly paid or unpaid for people from external groups. We all need to keep an eye on revenue as well through this time. I think it's fantastic to have some open support to bring that community feeling together as well, but also don't be ashamed if you need to put a dollar value on something that you've put a lot of time and energy into as well. If your hub or your co-working space closes, then when people come out of this isolation stage, there's actually less support for us on the tail end. And that whole idea about keeping a longer view of this might be 6 weeks, it could be 3 months, it could be 6 months, but we do need something to return to, and we do need infrastructure in place at the end of this period as well. That's pretty much it from me. I think that we've covered off a whole lot in this bunch, but again, I'll make my details available at the end of this, and if anybody would like to reach out, pick my brains, have a chat about any of the areas that Space Cube covers and what we're doing to transition online, I'm more than happy to pick up that conversation. Thank you.
Cool. Fantastic. Thanks, Carly. And I think if you have more questions about what's happening in Asia for Carly, you can post them in the Q&A and we might get to them, because I think that's a pretty interesting angle too. And yeah, thanks for drawing our attention back to that sort of that big picture view. Like, what's your hub or what's your network for? What was the original vision and mission? Was it already about nurturing healthy, resilient communities or delivering social benefits to regional communities? There's such a diversity of reasons for hubs to exist, but within that, grounding that sort of vision and values and the sort of originating story can be very, very important at this time to then figure out, okay, how do we still deliver on that mission differently and for different audiences? Cool. So we're just going to jump over to Q&A and Chad is going to moderate that. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And fantastic insights from everybody and great activity on the Q&A line. If you do have a quick Q&A, just feel free to add it in there. That way people can upvote and interact with it a bit more. And as we get through those, also hop on a chat if there's anything hanging out in there. I might just start with the top. Emma's asking a question for Di, and anyone else can pipe in. And this is interesting. It goes to something we were saying before, where a lot of the co-working hubs and things like that were already a bit challenged. And Di's, and what Emma's asking is, here in the Northwest of Victoria, we have co-working hubs doing everything from closing to staying open as self-serve facility. What's your advice to them in the months ahead in what already is a bit of a challenging business model? What do you reckon, Di?
Thanks, Chad, and thanks, Emma. Hello down there in Vic. Look, there's a few things. I think above all is that you need to abide by whatever the government's telling us to do at the time. That's first and foremost. The second is that whether you stay open or whether you close around what happens next in the coming months, you need to listen to your community. Every hub is going to be different. Some hubs still want people or will have people that still want to go in and have somewhere to work from to get out of the house, and isolate themselves in a co-working environment. Some won't want that, and they may, close down the physical facility. But if you are understanding what your community needs at the time, then you can start creating online courses or support networks or whatever it is that they're needing to start building the online courses and tools and resources around that and being the provision of that through an online method. So take the time in these co-working spaces that you have to regroup for yourself and think about that end point there that Carly made about what comes out the back of this. There is, I believe, a really great opportunity that co-working spaces may expand at the end of this because more people are going to get used to working remotely. Organizations are going to be more open to it. So, start thinking that way ahead. Also, make sure you touch in with your supporters of your hub, whether they be sponsors or in-kind supporters. Make sure you're talking to them, asking what their needs are. And finally, understand what the problems are. Isn't that what we do? We start with the problem first. So let's ask in our communities, what are the problems that need solving? And maybe some of our startups can be looking at solving some of those problems locally.
Great. Those are great points, Di. It actually aligns with that post you put in the Slack channel in regards to the Fin Review article saying co-working spaces will be coming back pretty strong. And also some of the points that people made in the survey responses on the opportunities. They actually say there might be an uptick in regional hubs where people come in because they need that connectivity. And it's really the only place in the region they can get it, along with internet access and all the other things that we know we can provide. I'm going to go to the next question. Space Cubed is asking, what's your recommendation for online courses balancing the need for in-person, live learning with not having people on the video call for hours on end? How do you facilitate that? And I know, Tori, you're kind of commenting on some of the structure on that, how that goes, but if anybody else wants to pipe in, what do you guys reckon? Recommendations for online courses balancing that in-person, live, and learning with not having people hanging out on vids for all the time?
I'm happy to take that one. So in my experience, you do need to have an online live component for course completion success. Otherwise, if you say, here's a course, and then they have no accountability, you're not going to have a high completion rate and a high success rate, and you've invested a lot of time and resources into something that's not going to be used, which is really unfortunate. So I like to see online courses delivered with maybe an offline self-paced component, as in a video and maybe some resources that go with that in different modules, but each module has a live check-in It might only be 30 minutes to recap, to do Q&A, but it's that accountability that I think is extremely important for an online course.
I might just add one there as well, and just put in that maybe the courses that we're offering now really need to take these things into consideration and need to be having segments of mental and physical breaks. So really encouraging people to take time out, go for a walk in the sunshine, do what you can, but they need to acknowledge that routine is important, but in that routine we still need to be getting away from our devices, and it's a perfect opportunity to do that.
And thank you for those. And I've got a couple of in additions to that. And one is to think through what's the purpose of this course, because you know, in most of your spaces, you've probably got those kind of events that are simply around attracting people or giving people a feel of community. And then other things are about specifically skill building. So get really clear about what your outcomes are in terms of whether it's knowledge, community, or something else. I've run courses with really simple technology, so it doesn't have to be fancy, though most of the peak groups I work with are maybe 10 at the maximum. But some of the things that you could think about is introducing movement into it and changing the way that you're teaching the lessons. And Di's already spoken about things like going for a walk, and in addition to that, get creative about the way people are using the spaces that they're isolating in. Within a group, even if you've got a bigger group, you could find ways to then separate people into, for example, a small group conversation, a pair or a three, and that just changes the energy a little bit. And a final thing is that, actually, no, there's two things. One is, you know, a lot of people at the moment are talking about all the study that they can catch up on all the reading, but the reality of doing that might be another story. So you could think that maybe you're, like Tori and Di have spoken about, even those half-hour check-ins that then allow someone to go and do that deep thinking that they haven't previously made time for could be a benefit. And the final suggestion is to take the opportunity to produce artifacts. So, for example, my theatre teacher has had to cancel her courses, and she's offered, just to keep us going, to send us an activity each week. And that activity can now get turned into kind of handouts, which eventually could become a workbook.
Great. Those are really some really good points. And it really speaks to, if I can just maybe pick up on some of the points of kind of that end-to-end experience. It's not just the webinar, it's the work you do beforehand, it's the structure of it, it's the after, much like we're trying to do with the Slack channel after, kind of maintain that community, which goes into kind of the core of what we were talking about before. Another question for Tori from Fleur. You mentioned that workshops and masterclasses can be done online, but facilitators need to be mindful of some adjustments that need to be made. Can you give maybe some examples of these adjustments specifically? I imagine shifts would also need to be made in the length of the event. Is there any research to support that or evidence of the time people can engage online? And I'll just add in, Tori, that that's a lot of the challenges that people mentioned in the surveys is, how do I get that in-person engagement when I can get them in the room, I can get that energy, I can look them in the eye, we can laugh. How do I translate online when they might get distracted checking phones, and are we wearing pants, are we not wearing pants, all these other things that might happen in an online world. How do you accommodate that and shift that to the video?
Absolutely. I think that the important thing when you're doing an online workshop, I do think that you could still have a workshop that's 2 hours in length, but you need to make sure 20 minutes of delivery and then you break. You need to make sure that you're not asking someone to stare at a computer for, they could just turn on YouTube, really. Like, we need to provide much more value than that. So 20 minutes maximum for talking to the screen. I would say that you need to make sure that you're utilizing software that has breakout features so that they can go have small group discussions. A key difference between webinars and workshops is having everyone in an interactive forum like this in a workshop, so that as a presenter, and I would cap it at 20 people so that you can get to know all the people in there. You can have really healthy and productive conversations. Whereas a webinar, it is more just an expert delivering advice around one topic, and it's not really a lot of conversation around that. So as a speaker facilitating a workshop, I would say include multiple different facets, including breakout sessions, which you can do in programs like Zoom, do offline resources, so things they still have to write, send those resources ahead of time and say, these are the things that we'll be working on, so they have them printed, so they're not doing it online, because we all know that, you know, you use different parts of your brain using digital versus writing, and so that they're using those parts of their brain and that they're writing. Encourage activities, going for a walk, taking a break, coffee break, get up, go outside. So encouraging disconnect. I would also encourage creative activity in a workshop. So whether that be something like drawing or building or anything in that sense, where you say, okay, if you've got you know, some crayons or some Lego, like, we're going to get creative here for a minute, and using those parts of your brain. So that's why it's really important that you don't just have any facilitator coming along and doing a workshop online, because you do need those really different aspects to make it a success.
Yeah, those are good points, Tori. And well, a lot of the people on the channel would be used to getting speakers and for their hubs and a bit of validation, a bit of curation to be able to help build up the speakers so they have quality content for the members. And I guess what you're saying is it's very similar to running an online workshop, much like Andrew curated yourselves to come and present here. So really just making sure that we get some core principles down. And I guess after the fact with your session next week that you're going to have, be able to help share some of those principles to help us kind of get in that online area. Di, I'm just going to throw it to you because we're sitting here in the chat on the panel session. You mentioned something about a post from Maria on LinkedIn. What can we do there?
So this was just in answer to Fleur's question about how we ensure that innovation stays top priority, or a top priority for government. And I did see just earlier this morning that Maria McNamara, for those that know her, has posted on LinkedIn. There's a survey going around for the whole innovation ecosystem for people to put in their recommendations to government, and they're going to collate that and put that through to ministers that are relevant. So jump on there. When we do share the Slack channel, there's actually a link to that post and also that form. But I think starting local as well, Fleur, like, we need to ensure that our local governments understand the value of entrepreneurship and innovative thinking right now, because it is important.
Yeah, thanks, Di. And for everyone else, that question that Fleur asked was, do you have any advice for ensuring that innovation stays at the top of the political agenda post this period we are now in, and we don't see a contraction and reaction that takes us to traditional policy around job creation the way we've seen in the past? And definitely that survey, as Di mentioned. And the other thing I'll just add in briefly is, there's always just a firm believer that whenever you provide value, that value is generally returned. And so whatever we can do, as many of the speakers have said, to say, how do we take that leadership role? What can we do to provide value in our regions, get recognized for that? Already working with some areas where they are stepping into how do we do economic diversification, particularly in regional areas in this new time. We will still need to maintain this momentum. We can't lose it. And so it is kind of introducing that conversation to local governments, introducing that conversation to people that we're typically funding, and saying, well, we still need that. And it's really us just collectively making the case for it. But that'll probably be a more in-depth conversation later on, but definitely check out that survey so we can add our voice to that. So another one from Zoe. I hope we start to work together to ensure we're not doubling up on programming, especially online, but instead sharing through our spaces. Can we look at setting up smaller groups per state? That's an interesting one. Love the panelist conversations on. A lot of people are going to be going online. A lot of people are going to be doing these kind of things. Boundaries no longer matter. Doesn't matter if it's, you know, Julia in Gunawindi, Simona Wagga Wagga, Katie down in Bunbury. We're all essentially just one massive co-working space in a digital world. How do we manage this now? It's a new era.
May I jump in, Chad? Sorry, thanks. I was going to say, I think what's really interesting, if we look at this as an opportunity, like you mentioned before, and I think Tori pointed out as well, it's a great leveler. Instead of looking at a geographical boundary as to what spaces and hubs may logically be working together because we're used to relying on physical proximity, what we actually have here is a really beautiful opportunity to instead form groups and clusters based on customer need. So for example, a SME will have a different set of needs to a scaling startup, which may have a different need to somebody in prop tech, or possibly as well somebody who is looking the import-export drop shipping is going to have massive issues at the moment as well, and things like that. It gives us a chance to collaborate at a much larger level, but be driven by the needs of our members and our clients. And I would encourage people to start to cluster with that in mind, possibly rather than who is down the road. Because if we experience a lock-in and we don't know how it's going to go here, but if we plan for the worst and work with whatever comes, whether I can walk down the road and visit somebody else's physical space becomes irrelevant.
That is really good, Kylie, and it speaks to what I was considering before, like if we can't rely on geographic boundaries as a competitive difference anymore, how does it get back to what was mentioned before? What's your core? What's the thing that got you out of bed in the morning in the first place? And how do you just double down on that one thing? You know, from a technology, from a industry sector, from a certain demographic of the community. What's your shtick? I'm going to touch base on a question here from Kayla, and it's something that came through on the surveys. Any advice on how to break through the noise of COVID-19 to ensure your messaging has impact? You look through Twitter right now, and there's just nothing on there apart from, you know, working from home and the virus and everything from surety to fear. And oh, by the way, we kind of need to do business as well. Like there's actual business that's being done somewhere that's not virus related. How do we cut through? Interested in conversations on that.
So it's Andrew here. So look, I think there's something very powerful about focusing. Kylie just mentioned particular clusters, but really understanding intimately who your community are and who you're wanting to speak to. Deep sort of customer engagement and using your existing platforms and connections. I think the broader sort of media landscape and message may not be it may not be worth throwing sort of time and energy and resources that. I think it's very dependent on who is this for, like who are you trying to communicate, and just being very focused in that way. I think there's actually going to be an incredible flowering, and I've seen it already, of much more sort of coherent communities of interest, whether they're forming online, people calling each other more frequently, but really sort of focusing down. So that's my thoughts, is don't try and shout louder, but like direct your voice and your listening more carefully. Thanks.
Yeah, which still comes back to, I guess, that theme that we're seeing come through here is really just what's the focus of what you're doing. I'm going to wrap up with one very practical, pragmatic question. It's from Katie, who's saying it'd be great to hear from Tori and others' experience around pricing online offerings. I'm seeing a perceived reduced value in courses offered online, not an opinion shared by myself, in regional WA. So what do we charge for these things? We kind of know price points for in person, $35 a head, X for beers and nibbles. What do you reckon?
So I think depending on the forum, so a webinar, you don't have to limit the amount of people. So I think that should be quite low cost. So I deliver webinars for business stations under the ASBAS Digital Solutions. And we have, for the last 12 months, they've been running it at, I think, $17 with very low uptake. And now it's reduced to $9 for webinars. That's across the board for Queensland, WA, and Northern Territory. Yesterday we had the discussion of, okay, now we're not doing workshops. We're doing online masterclasses, online workshops. Are we going to charge the same? And we decided, yes, we were. We decided that the value that we can provide online is just the same as offline. And so that's why I think it's really key that you are all already really plugged into the best innovators, the best speakers, the best presenters. There's no reason that the cost shouldn't be the same. And I also think that the key thing is that it's a masterclass. It's 15 to 20 people. It's slow. You're still getting that expert advice, that expertise for your business. So I think that the pricing needs to maintain the same. And I think it would be fantastic if, as a community of innovators here, if we kind of set that standard that, yes, it might be delivered online, but the value remains the same.
Cool. Andrew, I'll pass it over to you. And just a final comment, Di, I think somebody's asking for the invite link for the Slack channel. If we can maybe find that real quick and throw that in the chat. And
Sure, I'll put up.
awesome, thank you. And Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, so we'll put that link and the invite link to the Slack channel both in the chat, but also an email out to all registered participants. There'll also be an evaluation and feedback, and that's not just, you know, how did this go? That's looking at topics and insights for future events and webinars. So several of the presenters here are committed to doing something like this weekly, likely at the same day and same time. So you could pencil that in your diaries, and the rolling topics and the way that it's presented, whether it's, you know, by state or as a nation, will be informed by your responses to the survey. So please complete that. I think this is, you know, to use some of my language, this is an incredible moment of actually coming together as a very perceptive tribe. We literally have a couple of hundred community leaders from across Australia in the same place, thinking about the same things, with this incredible national infrastructure underpinning innovation, entrepreneurship and community resilience. And we're literally sort of on the same page and getting insights from each other about what is the state of the nation. This is sort of really, really powerful. So already the information we've received from you is fantastic and will be enhanced by you completing that survey. So yeah, thank you very much to all our presenters, Tori, Chad, Rachel, Diana, Carly, and everyone else who's pitched in to help make this happen. I think it's, yeah, an incredible example of community coming together at a critical time to do something really important, and look forward to continuing the discussions in the Slack channels and in future webinars. So thank you everyone for joining.